Morning. Glad to see everybody out today on this kind of first seemingly real day of fall. Nice and cool, and the leaves are kind of starting to change. It's good to see God's hand in His creation, and it's good to be here this morning with His people. This morning we'll be looking at Joshua chapters 23 and chapter 24. If you want to be opening up your Bibles there, Joshua 23 and 24, we'll conclude, hopefully, the text section of the book of Joshua, and then on Wednesday, Lord willing, we'll have a review of the book, and Jay will be teaching that. He'll cover the review and kind of talk through some possibly unanswered questions. And then depending on what Jay is able to cover in that review class, next Sunday, it's kind of a flex class, so we'll see what he talks about, and maybe we can hit on some other open points or open questions overall from the book of Joshua. So before we get started, let's go to God in prayer, please. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for another opportunity like this to be able to come together, to open up your word, to study it. We ask that as we look at these things this morning, we're able to call to mind how dependable of a God that you are, how loving of a God you are, and have that cause us to have a love for you in turn, a dependence on you, a desire to follow after you, to keep your word, your will, and your commandments, and help us to be successful in everything that we do. We thank you so much for the ultimate blessing of your Son, in whom we can have dependence. And just like the Israelites here with Joshua conquering the land, we know that ultimately our salvation, our rest is in your hands, and help us to put all of our desires, our hope, and our confidence in that and in that alone. Help us not to be tarnished or made dirty or unclean by the world, but help us to be a light to it and cause them to come to you and to be grafted into your people. Thank you so much for everything you do for us, and it's in His name that we pray. Amen. All right. So Joshua chapter 23 and 24. So we've kind of gone through a lot of the action of the book, and then the history of the dividing up of the land, and then like last Wednesday, Jay talking about the cities of refuge and the Levitical cities, and then talking about the event between east and west and a possible tarnishment of the land of people maybe following after and setting up their own altars and idols and a profane worship. And you see the probably a rashness like Jay talked about, but at least some semblance of sincerity on the people's behalf to follow after God, to try to make sure that what they're doing is holy. And holiness, again, has been one of the big themes of the book of Joshua, and we'll see that this morning. But the last two chapters here are concluding speeches by Joshua to the people. In chapter 23, you've got him talking, it seems like, to the elders of the people, some of the leaders among the people. And then in chapter 24, God speaks through Joshua at the beginning, but now he's addressing all of the congregation of Israel, all the tribes of in chapter 24. There's a lot of similarities between the two of them. There are some notable differences that we'll talk about as we go through them. And then there's also a very profound similarity in these concluding speeches at the end of Joshua's life to speeches like Moses gave at the end of his life in Deuteronomy chapter 32 and 33. I think, again, this is one of those pieces in the book of Joshua where the author is drawing out these comparisons between Moses and between Joshua, and how Joshua is a successor to Moses and leading the people and claiming their inheritance here. One thing I do think that stresses, though, is that although someone like Moses, a servant of the Lord, and a great one at that, was someone who was replaceable. In a sense, in our jobs, we kind of think about, am I replaceable? Yes, everybody is replaceable. A leader like Moses, great as he was, someone else like Joshua, also great, can step in and fill his shoes. But that ultimately shows our greater desire to have someone who cannot be replaced, and that being our Lord Christ. Even great men come on the scene after him, like Paul, right? I mean, a lot of the New Testament is dedicated to Paul and his teaching, his preaching. But even he, great as he was, constantly reaffirms his inferiority to his master and to his predecessor in Christ. So the speeches in Joshua chapter 23 and 24, they kind of have this general theme about them where there's this looking back on what God has done for his people, a reflection on who God is, how he's been with his people thus far, everything that he's done to fulfill his promises to his people. Then following that, look forward to what the people can expect God to continue to do on their behalf, that this isn't just a one-time event in the past, that God has been with his people, he is currently with his people, and he will continue to be with his people as long as they have a desire to be with him. Then there's this call, very similar, back to the beginning of the book in Joshua chapter 1, this call to be courageous, call for the people to be confident in God, call for them to follow after the will of God and to keep his law, not to turn from it to the right hand or to the left hand, but to keep it wholeheartedly, to keep it in all sincerity and with faith, to hold fast to him, to cling to God, and we'll talk about that idea a little bit later. And then ultimately, this is the big theme, and it's kind of not talked about at length, but the idea of loving God, right? That this has to stem from a desire to have a relationship with God. That's the root, the foundation of this relationship that God is supposed to have with his people. It is dependent upon them having a love for God that will be borne out in their following after his will and keeping his commandments. It will result in them holding fast to God and clinging to him. So this ultimate and underlying love for God is one of the primary things that Joshua wants to drive out and calls the people to remember and to do. It's not just some cold-hearted, meticulous law-keeping in the sense of I've got to do this, I've got to check off this list, and then God will be with me. It's got to be born out of a love, an appreciation, and a relational aspect with God. But the other side of that coin is what happens when you don't follow God, when you forsake him, when you turn away from him, when you go after and you cling to these other gods that are in the land, or the gods from Egypt, or the gods of your ancestors, as we'll see in chapter 24. They've been successful and confident up to this point in time. God has caused them to be able to chase out their enemies. One man can cause 1,000 to be run off. But if you start to forsake God, he will start to allow them to be dispossessed in the land. One of the themes I think that we see in the book with people like Rahab and even the Gibeonites in a sense versus people like Achan is this desire of the inhabitants of the land to fear God like Rahab, it says that she does, that she fears God, she believes in the one true God of Israel, and then she's grafted in, right? She becomes like an Israelite. But you think about it from the sin of Achan, he tries to take things on himself and hoard this treasure and make his own riches, so to speak. And in doing so, he becomes like a Canaanite, and then he is cast out and he is destroyed. And so the idea that if you are like them, your punishment will be like theirs, right? What's happening in this conquest of the land and God giving the people this land was a fulfillment of the promises for sure, and God gifting them this possession, this inheritance to them, but it is also a punishment on the people of Canaan for their wickedness and their following after these other gods. So Israel, if you become like Canaan, you can expect the same punishment that Canaan is now currently experiencing, namely the expulsion of the land that God has worked so hard to give you. So that's kind of the overlying setup of how these speeches go. So let's dive right into Joshua chapter 23. I do want to take the time, if we can, just to read this. It's the chapter 23 is just 16 verses, so let's read that in its entirety here. It says, "Now it came to pass, a long time after the Lord had given rest to Israel from all of their enemies round about, that Joshua was old, advanced in age. And Joshua called for all Israel, for their elders, for their leaders, for their judges, and for their officers. And he said to them, I am old, advanced in age. You have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you, for the Lord your God is he who has fought for you. See, I have divided to you by lot these nations that remain, to be an inheritance for your tribes from the Jordan, with all the nations that I have cut off as far as the great sea westward. And the Lord your God will expel them from before you and drive them out of your sight. So you shall possess their land as the Lord your God promised you. Therefore, be very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, lest you turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left. Unless you go unless you go among the nations, those who remain among you. You shall not make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause anyone to swear by them. You shall not serve them, nor bow down to them. But you shall hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out them before you great and strong nations. But as for you, no one has been able to stand against you to this day. One man of you shall chase 1,000. For the Lord your God is he who fights for you, as he promised you. Therefore take careful heed to yourselves, that you love the Lord your God. Or else, if indeed you do go back and cling to the remnant of those nations, these that remain among you, and you make marriages with them, and you go into them, and they know you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps to you, and scourges on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. Behold, this day I am going the way of all the earth, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one thing has failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spoke concerning you. All have come to pass for you, not one of them has failed. Therefore, it shall come to pass that as all the good things have come upon you which the Lord your God promised you, so the Lord will bring upon you all harmful things until he has destroyed you from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. When you have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods and bowed down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land which he has given you. All right. So initially, it talks about in the first two verses here in chapter 23 how the conquest of the land has in a sense, the military conquest of the land has been completed. There is now this rest that the people are getting to experience, and Joshua calls the people to come to him, whether this is at Shechem or at Shiloh. It doesn't say specifically here, but the leaders of the people have come to Joshua, and it seems like he's having this intimate discussion with them. And then in verse 3, he talks about what they have just experienced. It says in verse 3, you have seen all that the Lord has done to all these nations, because of the Lord your God is he who fights for you. So he's calling upon the people to have this recollection, to have this remembrance on their firsthand experience of being with God. These are things that you have experienced. They're part of your recent memory, but I think that calls to mind that just for the people in this day, so is the same with us, that we need to take time to count our blessings, to focus on who God is, to focus on what he's done for us, and whether it be in recent memory or things in the past, but taking time to stop and reflect on all of the good things that the Lord has worked in their lives, has worked in our lives. Because even when bad things might befall us, or bad things might come our way, it's always easier to stop and say, and to even be to a degree at peace with the fact that, like Job says, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. It's easier to do that, it's easier to say that if you can first focus on and recollect and recall that the Lord is he who gives. All the good gifts that we have been blessed with in our lives are ultimately from him. And so he's calling on the people here to focus on that he is a God who has fought for you. And he calls to mind in verse 4 specifically that we've been given this land. You were there, I was there. We divided this land up by lot. It is yours now. It was God's, and he has gifted it to you. It has been divided and given to you. And all the inhabitants of the land have been cut off before you. There's never been one people group that has been able to withstand their advances. If the people went out and fought against them, with the exception of Ai, of course, because of the sin of Achan, but when they went to fight, they won because God is with them. The inhabitants of the land have been cut off. And then he says in verse 5 that the Lord will continue to expel these people out from the land, right? That this is not just a one-time historical event that, okay, that happened, now we're done with that. But the people can expect to experience God's presence among them in the future, right? That's so not only to taking time to reflect on what God has done for us, but to think on and to remember and appreciate the fact that God will continue to be with us, that he is a God who keeps his promises. He will continue to fight for the people just like he said he would. It's important to remember that the people, especially now, coming near the end of Joshua's life, and Joshua is about to go the way of all the earth, he's about to pass on. The people are still grasshoppers in a land of giants, right? That's how they viewed themselves. That's what they were. The only reason they were able to accomplish all the things that they've accomplished was because God was the one who was fighting with them. And that will continue to be the case, even after the death of Joshua. If they are able to cling to God and still be with him, the fact that they are small and the people of the land are big or giants, that doesn't matter. And the fact that even a leader is passing on ultimately doesn't matter. The people have to have their faith and their ultimate trust in God. Think about what has happened up to this point in time. Remember that can continue to happen for you in the future as the people progress into the land. And that should cause a response from the people, right? There's this word then, therefore, in verse 6, and that calls to mind several other therefore type passages. I think one of the most famous ones, is in Romans chapter 12. Therefore, in light of the mercies of God. First off, you have to understand the mercies of God. What are they? That's what the first 11 chapters of Romans are about, the mercies of God. But you have to understand, appreciate who God is, what he has done for you, just like he talked to the people. Think back about what God has just done for you. Remember, he will continue to do that. Therefore, that should cause a response. That should cause the people to be courageous. Again, likening back to Joshua chapter 1. Think about what God has done. Have that cause in you this desire and ability to be courageous, even though hardships are still around the corner. To keep the law. Again, likening back to God's command to Joshua in Joshua chapter 1. Remember the law. Remember the ordinances that God has given you. The idea of kind of remember what got you here. The Psalms speak to the law like a set of instructions or a roadmap or a lamp. So remember what got you here. Focus on God's law. Remember the instructions that you followed to get to this point, and remember the failure when you didn't do that. Remember the sin of Achan. Remember the events of Balaam. Balaam we'll talk about again a little bit later. Remember what happens when you fail to live up to that standard. There are consequences, but therefore keep the law. Keep yourselves from idolatry, right? This is going to be one of the big themes, especially as we move into the book of Judges. But in verse 7 here in chapter 23, it talks about there's these other gods in the land, right? There's these other peoples in the land that serve these other gods. That's the main thing. It's not just the fact that there's other people in the land, but it's they have the ability to drag you away from me. They have the ability to cause you to serve after and long for and cling to these other gods, and that's where the issue will arise. But keep yourselves pure from idolatry. Keep yourselves away from that in verse 7. And then ultimately to hold fast to God, the idea of clinging to God. That's the Hebrew word debak, which means to hold to tightly. The idea of soldering, molding things together is the word debak. There's things that are supposed to be coming together, joined together, molded together, soldered together, so that they don't come apart, or don't come apart easily, we should say. It's the same word that's used back in Genesis to talk about when the man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife. Right? That's supposed to be this relationship that is brought together, molded together, so that it does not come apart. These people here are supposed to hold fast to God. Then in verse 11, like I mentioned, this is the overall foundation of everything. It says in verse 11, therefore take careful heed to yourselves that you love the Lord your God. All right, so this has to be born out of, it has to be an underlying current of this relational aspect to God, a deep and affectionate love for him, because everything else then just becomes a means to an end, right? If you have this love for God, then all these other things will flow out of it naturally. As later on in chapter 24 it'll put it, following God wholeheartedly, in sincerity and truth. But it has to begin with this emotional, affectionate response to him, understanding and appreciating who he is, so that all these other things become very simple and not just ritualistic religious acts. Several steps, along the way here in the book of Joshua and throughout the whole Old Testament in general, you've got these altars that have been set up. You've had these memorials that were set up, right? And the idea with those was to call a memory to mind of what God had done for his people, and to think on that, and to have that engage this emotional response to that. To have your children ask questions. What does it mean? What does this festival mean? What does that altar mean? Well, it means this, and it talks about how God loves us, and that is supposed to engage us. It's supposed to cause our affections to be stirred up. It's not unlike when we come together each first of the week here to memorialize, to focus on, to look back on what God has done for us, to partake in this altar that's been kind of set up behind us, and that would hopefully engage inside of you this emotional response, this affectionate response, this desire to have a love and an admiration for God that causes us to want a deeper relationship with him. And then not to, or to be careful not to have these altars, these memorials that are set up in our life, not just to be passing landmarks that become so familiar to us that they don't mean anything else, right? But it has to be born out of this love and a relational aspect and approach to God. So he starts off with the positive aspects of being with God, right? Thinking about all the good things that God has done for you, all the good things that he will continue to do for you. This relational aspect, this love. But there is another side to the coin. There is this flip side, and he starts that in verse 13. Verse 12, or else, right? You had the therefore, appreciate what God has done for you and respond to him this way. Then the other side of it is this or else, and you have the negative aspects that are listed when the people will turn away from God, starting in verse 13, that God will drive the people out, God will stop driving the people out before them, that they will be a snare and a trap and a constant problem for you. And then the idea that the good things that they have been given will be lost. There's 5 times in this back half of Joshua chapter 23 where Joshua mentions all the good things, the good land, the good gifts, the good things from the good giver, God himself. But those things can be taken away from the people. They can be turned into harmful things if they don't continue to follow God in the appropriate way. Talks about not entering into relations with the people in this marital aspect, but it's more than just, it's easy to read passages like that and think about it from the standpoint of not marrying foreign people, not marrying other peoples of another nation, of another race, and how that maybe takes away from the purity of Israel and the purity of this particular racial bloodline. But that's not exactly the point that God has in mind here, that Joshua has in mind here. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 21, actually, let's turn over there and read that really quickly, just to give you some context here. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 21. Because God has clearly talked about not having the people intermarry for the specific purpose of them being drawn away to these other gods. And I think that is the main cue that we need to take from that we not enter into these relationships that would cause us to be taken away from the most important relationship in our lives. Deuteronomy chapter 21, starting in verse 10. It says, when you go out and you war against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire her, and you would take her for your wife, then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall have her head and nails trimmed. And she shall put off the clothes of her captivity, and remain in your house, and mourn her father and her mother for a full month. After that, you may go into her, and you may be her husband, and she shall be your wife. And it shall be that if you have no delight in her, then you shall set her free, but you shall certainly not sell her for money. You shall not treat her brutally, because you have humbled her. All right, so the idea isn't just this completely abstaining from marriage to these foreign people, but when that causes you to be brought away from God. All right, because when she came into the house, she is supposed to completely cleanse herself and remove herself from everything about her past, all her gods, all her idols. But now she's supposed to be completely grafted into the people of Israel. She is supposed to have your God be her God, a very similar concept to what Rahab went through, right? She was this foreign woman that had this faith and this trust and this hope in Jehovah God. She knew who he was, she appreciated who he was, and wanted to be part of his people. And so she is grafted into to Israel, so much so that she becomes a pretty important, or there's a pretty important descendant that comes from her. Who's that? Yeah, Christ himself. And we also have a similar story with Ruth later, right? And you've got Moses. I think it's in Numbers chapter 12, where he marries a Cushite woman, and then Aaron and Miriam get all up in arms about that, and they get mad at Moses. And then God gets mad at them for going to make arguments and make trouble for Moses. So it's not just this keeping yourselves pure of these foreign nations in the sense of don't intermingle these racial bloodlines. Keep Israel pure. That's kind of the Pharisaical approach later on. But Jesus said, I can raise up children from Abraham from these stones. It's not about the racial aspect. It's about this. Can they take you away from God? They've got these other gods. They've got these other way of life about them that can draw you away from me. That's what you need to be wary of. That's what you need to not fall after. That's what you need to shy away from. Picking up there in verse 14 and following, verse. All right, I lost my place here. In verse 14, behold, this day I'm going all the way of all the earth. So Joshua acknowledges his age and that he's close to death. But then he says, and you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one thing has failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spoke concerning you. All have come to pass for you. Not one of them has failed. All right, so this, again, recalling back to what God has done for the people. You know what God has done. You just look inside you, think about your history, think about your recent history and the things you have recently experienced, and know that God has been on your side, God is with you. And that's another reason why you don't turn away to these other foreign nations, because what are they in comparison to what God is doing for you? Then it's interesting to note about, in the kind of closing of that chapter there, this dark knowing about what the future certainly holds. Joshua's kind of calling that out. He understands the heart of the people. He knows that, okay, these people are still among you. There is this realistic approach to what Joshua is saying. They are definitely still among you. They are going to be a problem for you. Do what you can to make that not the case. But he has this dark knowing about what the future certainly holds for the people. And that harmful things, just as God has promised all these good things that have come to pass for you and on your behalf, bad things can await you if you choose to forsake him, turn away from him and go after these other gods. And I think it's interesting to note at the very end of chapter 23, it says, the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you shall perish quickly from the land. And think about how long has it taken the people to claim this land now? What's that?
40-some years.
Yeah, 40 years, 7 years for the actual conquest. If you go back to Abraham, we're talking hundreds of years, right? And you can think about it, each one of those, right? And whenever they were, or God was talking to Moses about the actual conquering of the land, he said specifically, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to do it little by little. It's going to take a long time, right? So this actual possession of this great gift, this great promise, takes a while, right? But it can be taken away quickly. The idea that they're turning their back on God, can have immediate consequences, right? And I think, again, likening Joshua here to Romans chapter 1, that you want to go after these other things, God will let you do that. And don't be surprised when you have to face the quick ramifications of doing just that.
But even still, how long is it before they're taken
Yeah, you've still got obviously all the hundreds of periods of the judges. You've got you could argue that they're taken into captivity and made vassals during that period of the judges, but the ultimate captivity and being carried off to Babylon is still several hundred years away. Yeah. Yeah, well, the quickly aspect, I think, in Judges is probably, we'll talk about all these cycles that seem to happen one after the other, after the other, after the other. There can be immediate ramifications for turning your back on God. Good stuff. Any other comments or questions on chapter 23? All right. Then moving into chapter 24, you've got the first couple of verses that kind of set the stage that all the people are coming to Shechem now, right? We've talked about the previous establishments of the people, most recently in Shiloh, where it seems like the altar was set up now, but now all the people here are coming to Shechem. So to kind of put that in from a map perspective over here on the west side of the Jordan, between Ephraim and Manasseh, there's Shechem and Shiloh just in there. Shechem is actually on the side of Manasseh. Shiloh is in Ephraim. The people seem to move northward up to Shechem. This is the first time that Shechem is mentioned in the book of Joshua outside of the actual division of the land. But you do have previous occurrences where the people are, back in chapter 8, there was the renewal of the covenant between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, which seems to be in this area of Shechem. But this is the first time that Shechem is specifically mentioned. So it's interesting to note that there was this previous covenant renewal, this reading of the law, this rewriting of the law, reading of it to the people in chapter 8, and you do something very similar here at the end of the book in Joshua chapter 24. There's another pretty big event from a land perspective that happens in Shechem. Does anybody know what that is? It's where God first made his promises to Abraham about the land. It was back in Genesis chapter 12 and verses 6 and 7. At the beginning of chapter 12, God calls Abraham to come out of the land of his fathers, tells him he's going to make him a great nation, and then he takes him into the land of Canaan. And they go specifically to Shechem, and it's at Shechem where God tells them, see this land? I'm going to give this to you. All right? And so now the people are re-coming and reestablishing here at Shechem to have this kind of covenant renewal ceremony at the end of Joshua's life. It says that they, in chapter 24, that they are presenting themselves before God. So it's very likely that the tabernacle, the sanctuary, has been moved and set up here, at least for this event. We talk about the sanctuary here in verse 26 of chapter 24. And then this idea of presenting themselves before the Lord very likely indicates that the tabernacle was there, the Ark of the Covenant was there. And then God speaks through Joshua at the beginning of this chapter. Very similar layout, but with more detail to what we just read in chapter 23. Here in chapter 24, one of the things I think that's pretty interesting to note is the similarities and the way this is outlined in chapter 24 with other known treaties and covenants of the day in this land, specifically Hittite treaties about the second millennia. So that kind of sets it in this cultural context and how this is set up and established. And these ancient Near Eastern treaties, it started with the preamble, the identification of who the author, who the establisher of the covenant was. Then this historical prologue describing the previous relationship of the two parties that are involved. The stipulations of this covenant, of this treaty, specifically what the lesser's obligations are to the one who is the ultimate one in power, the greater party. Then there's this deposit or this kind of offering made in the temple, so to speak, in the public reading of and recounting of the treaty itself. Witnesses are established in ancient Near Eastern treaties. The gods are called to be witness to this particular transaction. And then lastly, the cursings and blessings that are laid out. The gods will punish the people or bless the people or those involved, whether this covenant has been kept or not. But you see a very similar, is it cut off? Interesting. Very similar layout in this section here in Joshua chapter 24. You've got the preamble, where he says, thus says the Lord God of Israel, right? So you've got the author of this treaty being established. Then the historical prologue in verses 2 through 13, where God talks about his relationship with the Israelites all the way from Abraham up until this present moment in time. The stipulations where the people are to serve him, they're to long for him and to serve him and to put away these other gods. And then in verse 26, this deposit of the public reading, Joshua writes down this in the official record, right? This is going in the book. Witnesses are called. You've got the people themselves being a witness to this transaction. They say that we are witnesses of what this covenant is that we're entering into. And Joshua sets up this memorial stone, and he says, listen, they've heard all the things or the stone has heard all the things that God has said, so it's going to be a memorial and a witness to these events as well. And then obviously, similar to chapter 23, the cursings and the blessings that are established, verses 19 through 20, where there will be no forgiveness for the people if they turn this way, and then harm will ultimately befall them. So he starts off in that historical narrative, going through chapter 24, verses 2 through 13, going through the entire history of the people. All right, so Joshua in chapter 23 just talked about the things that they had recently experienced. You have seen, and we've conquered this land. God has divided it up for us. He has caused our enemies not to be able to stand before us. Now, the Lord is speaking here, as we saw in verse 2, and he recounts all of his history with his people, going all the way back to Abraham and to actually Abraham's father, Terah. And it also specifically mentions Nahor. Does anybody remember who Nahor was? Yeah, he was Abraham's brother, and who were some of his offspring? That was Haran, but yeah. They play into the story pretty well. Lot was the Haran, the other brother. His offspring, Nahor's offspring was Laban and Rebekah, right? So you got actually them kind of being specifically ingrained into this story. But God's calling of Abraham from that land, from the land of his fathers, and then bringing him into Canaan and showing him this new land. But it's in thinking about Abraham being in Mesopotamia, being in this foreign land, it says there at the end of verse 2, when he called Abraham, he was serving what? The end of verse 2. Yeah, other gods, right? And then mentioning of Nahor, and like I said, his offspring, Laban. Remember a specific event with Laban and Rachel when she was running away? What'd she take with her? Yeah, she took household idols, right? So you've got this in you from the start, all the way back. You have this inclination to serve after other gods, to be like the people around you, and that'll come up in just a minute. But God calls Abraham out of this land into a new life. He shows him this land and says, "That's what I'm going to give you." He gives Abraham many descendants, specifically the son of promise, Isaac. And it talks about how to Isaac was Jacob and Esau. Esau, became the people of Edom, and they received their land. But Jacob went down to Egypt, right? And they were there for several hundred years, in bondage eventually, and then slavery. Then God raised up leaders like Moses and Aaron to come to the people, to be representatives of God, to not only to the people but to Pharaoh himself. And then you have the plagues that are brought upon the land of Egypt. And right about this point in time, you see in this historical narrative the terminology shift from they, them, your fathers. Now it's you. These are things that you directly have experienced. So if you recall in Numbers chapter 14, whenever God says that all the people that are above the age of 20 are going to die off in the wilderness. So there's likely some people who were under the age of 20 during the Exodus event who had seen the Exodus event firsthand. You actually have the leaving of Egypt. There's significant detail given to the crossing at the Red Sea and how God had been with his people and miraculously saved them. The wilderness wandering is kind of mentioned in passing because I think it wasn't this group of people who were the cause for that, so he doesn't give it a lot of attention there. The Eastern Conquest, and it's going to cut off again. And then he mentions Balak and Balaam. But it's kind of interesting. This is the third time in the book of Joshua alone that Balaam has been mentioned. Why might that be particularly interesting for the people, especially in the context of what Joshua's communicating to the people right now? If you recall the story, the Balak, the king of Moab, called on Balaam to, come here and curse the people, and God wouldn't let Balaam do that. And God, it says here, God didn't listen to him, but he kept blessing them over and over and over again. But what did Balaam do after that? He was physically, apparently, unable to curse the people. So what was his scheme after that? Yeah, he was able to use the women of Moab to entice the people to be pulled away, right? So it plays in exactly to what Joshua is talking about here with the people. Be mindful of that. Third time that Balaam and Balak are mentioned in this book. Be mindful of that thing. It can and will happen. You need to be on the lookout for it. Then you've got the crossing of the Jordan and the western conquest, and then ultimately at the end of that section there in verse 13, this giving of this gift, this inheritance to the people. It's this land that they haven't worked for. It wasn't your sword or your bow that did it. It was me, me doing all of the work, sending out the hornet in front of you. You're inheriting cities and homes that you didn't build, that you didn't work for. You're getting vineyards, you're getting olive groves that, again, you didn't plant. So this is God's ultimate gift and blessing that he's bestowing upon his people. And then it's time to decide for the people. Joshua lays out this choice to them. It's time for you all to make a decision about where you're going to go from here. I wish we had time to read this entire section, but he says you've got a choice to make. You can serve the Lord your God, and you can put away these other gods. Those are you can serve the Lord your God and put away these other idols. These ones that have been kind of throughout your family and all your history, going back to Abraham and Terah and Nahor. Or you can serve those previous gods. You go after them. It says that you can cling to them. So it's kind of a play on words with what we saw earlier. That clinging to God versus clinging to these idols. You can serve the gods of your fathers, you can serve the gods of Egypt, or you can serve the gods that are currently in your land. So again, Joshua's realism in the fact that these other influences are still there. But Joshua, in a famous verse, in verse 15, if it seems evil for you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. The end there. But as for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord. So you've got Joshua, being this fearless and courageous leader, being able to stand up to what might be easy to give into, but his leadership by example, and that's why it says at the close of the book that all the days of Joshua and even the elders who were kind of with Joshua and remembered all those events, the people served God during that time frame. So you see Joshua's leadership and his being the type of godly leader and godly leadership that God desires for his people, these godly influences that people can have in their lives compared to the ungodly influences that can ultimately draw them away. We see that play out time and time again throughout the judges, and the people allow the other influences of the land to drive them away, especially and more poignantly, I think, in the time of the kings, whenever there's a good king versus a bad king and how things fare for the nation at that point in time. The people acknowledge that, okay, we will serve the Lord, and they have actually an immediate reflection on what God has done for them as well. They call to mind very similar events that God and Joshua have just done. God brought us out of the land of Egypt. He has caused us to be able to conquer this land successfully. And then in verse 19, you've got this pretty harsh statement that just seems kind of come out of nowhere. Joshua here is imploring the people to serve God. You've got a choice to make. But then Joshua just says, what? You can't do it. That's the fascinating thing when you think about it, that I'm imploring you to do this. I'm telling you there is a choice, but then he just says, you can't. You can't do it. I think that the way to kind of analyze that verse is the fact there, in the middle there, it says, for your God is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions nor your sins. So you have this bleak outlook. But the point being that your God is a jealous God for you. All right, the gods of the land, the gods of the Canaanites, the Amorites, the ones that you're going in to possess, they have these petty jealousies and rivalries in between themselves. But your God has a desire to have a relationship with you. And when you turn your back on that, and that's where he kind of picks up in verse 20 there, he says, if you forsake the Lord, right? So this isn't a absolute statement that Joshua is making here. It's if it is dependent on your relationship to God and how that ultimately will play out. So let's finish up this slide real quick. Again, the people say, no, Joshua, you've got it wrong. We will serve the Lord our God. Who else are we going to serve? The people reaffirm that. They say that we will be witnesses to this event. And then the people will be witnesses for themselves. There's the stone that's set up by the oak of the sanctuary. Again, it is to be a witness. And then it says in verse 28 that the people there depart and go back to their inheritance. All right, so then the theme, the last little bit of the book, talks about the ultimate fulfillment of the people getting their inheritance. The people disperse, go back to their individual tribal lands. And then you have these three funerals. You've got Joshua, who is finally called the servant of the Lord. Moses is called the servant of the Lord 14 times in the book of Joshua. Joshua has not been called that yet. Started off with him being the servant or the aide of Moses, right? And now he has progressed to be that worthy leader to fulfill the shoes of Moses. He is called the servant of the Lord. He's buried in his inheritance in Timnath Serah, which means the abundant possession. You see the results of his godly leadership and deliverance or remembrance of God throughout his life. Joseph is buried, likening back to his promise to his brothers that take my bones with you when you go. His land, or he is buried in his inheritance, in the inheritance of Ephraim. And then Eleazar the priest is also buried in the land of his son Phinehas. So with all three of those burials, you've got the inheritance aspect associated with it, right? So again, the importance of this land is now yours because your God has given it to you. All right, that kind of closes the